I wish to thank all of our spokespersons for the introductions. And now it's my pleasure to introduce former Prime Minister and member of the Knesset, Benjamin Netanyahu. Mr. Netanyahu received a BSc in architecture and an MSc in business management from MIT, where he also studied political science. Between 1979 and 1984, Netanyahu initiated 2 international conferences that emphasized the need to fight terrorist organizations and their supporting regimes. In 1984, he was Israel's ambassador to the United Nations, during which time he became a renowned and tireless champion of Israel's cause in the international arena. In 1991, he was a senior member of the Israeli delegation to the Madrid Peace Conference, and as such participated in the first strategic cooperation between Israel and the United States of America. In 1993, Mr. Netanyahu was elected Likud party chairman and served as head of the opposition until his election as prime minister in 1996. During his term as prime minister, Mr. Netanyahu implemented terror-fighting policy along with the advancement of the peace process. Its cornerstone was the conclusion of well-measured agreements with the Palestinians that insisted on reciprocity. During his 3-year term, the number of terror attacks drastically decreased. In 2002, Netanyahu returned to politics first as Minister of Foreign Affairs, and then, in the course of 2003, as Minister of Finance. He initiated policies that encouraged growth by reducing the public sector and strengthening the private sector. We are proud that Mr. Netanyahu is a frequent guest at IDC Herzliya and a friend, and we welcome him.
How quickly they fall. But they rise again, as you'll see. Well, thank you, Jonathan Davis, for these kind remarks, and thank you, Professor Eichmann, for a great act of imagination and initiative in starting this center. One of its greatest accomplishments is it doesn't take money from the Israeli government. It has many other benefits, but I have to stress this one. And I think it's an example of public-private entrepreneurship that is unequaled. I want to also recognize the excellent panel that came before us, Mayor German and Shabtai Shavit and Boaz Ganor, and have I forgotten? And all of you who are here. I think the problem of terrorism is due primarily to its international component. If we were dealing merely with manifestations of terror in Peru or in Northern Ireland, we would not be making this international conference. And the real problem of terror is the terror that we've experienced in the last half century, is the array of forces that stand behind it. The problem is not merely the weapon of warfare, which is terrorism. It's the forces that are wielding this weapon. In the late 1960s and up to the early 90s, the forces were basically 2 behind international terrorism. It was an informal but effective alliance between radical Arab regimes on the one hand and the former Soviet Union and its satellites on the other. And this spawned terror groups, terror campaigns, hijackings is the most notable one in the 1970s and 1980s that became a world plague. You couldn't board airplanes without the fear that these beasts were prowling our airways, and if you remember the Achille Laur, also our waterways without being hijacked, kidnapped, murdered, held for ransom, or blown up. And of course, simultaneously, you also had this efflorescence of the various terror groups inside Europe, the Red Army faction or the Brigata Rosse and the other terror groups that were secretly supported by the Soviet Union and often in cahoots with Arab regimes like Libya and so on. So this was a structure that kept this weapon of proxy warfare operating with greater and greater intensity until it collapsed. What made it collapse was, first of all, the collapse of the Soviet Union. Because Russia did not, modern Russia, the Republic of Russia, does not pursue these policies anymore, happily we can say. But at the same time, what also stopped terrorism dead in its tracks was the action that was taken against the offending Arab states. Now, there was a great deal of discussion at the time, and I myself, as Boaz Ganor mentioned, I was involved in several international conferences that had a provocative idea. And the provocative idea was that terror was not the result of frustrated individuals sitting in a cafe in Milan or in Benghazi, but that it was a form of proxy warfare by states, and if you attacked the states, you would stop the terror. If you exacted a price for what otherwise seemed to be this covert, secret operation, if you uncloaked it and exacted a price for it, it would stop. And there was an intense debate on this subject. And people said, well, what would you do? I said, well, you should apply, I and others said this, you should apply political sanctions, diplomatic sanctions. You don't have to let the planes of offending states land in your airspace, operate in your airspace or land in your airports. You could apply economic sanctions, and you could apply military sanctions. And people said, what would you do? Bomb them? And I said, yes, if need be, yes, of course. Now, Israel itself was, of course, an example of a country that was able to push off terror attacks on its own borders by by doing precisely this. It did this opposite Egyptian-sponsored terrorism in the Suez campaign, exacted a price from Egypt, exacted a price from other neighbors, and ultimately pushed back the tide of terror. But when this was applied globally, most notably in the American bombing of Libya, the other buttress of international terrorism collapsed. And so by the late 80s and the beginning of the 90s, it seemed, with the passing of the Soviet Union and the punishment meted out to Arab states, it seemed as though international terrorism was a thing of the past. I had read an article to that effect, effectively claiming the great victory of the liberal democracies and the free market over the other systems, including the triumph over terrorism, and that this was, well, it wasn't exactly the end of history, but it was sort of the end of history. It was a brilliantly written article in an unnamed intellectual magazine, and I called up the editor, very renowned editor, whom I shall not reveal her, and I said, Norman, how did you allow such nonsense to be printed? And he said, well, I'm not the editor now. And I said, well, your spirit hovers. How did you allow this? And he said, what's wrong with it? And I said, everything's wrong with it. Neither terrorism has disappeared, except momentarily, and liberal democracies have not won anything. Well, they won a bloodless victory in the Cold War, but there's a new bully on the block. And he said, what do you mean? And I said, well, it's militant Islam. And he said, you really think so? And I said, yes, I do. And I think in many ways it's more pernicious and more dangerous. Its reach is more global. Its inhibitions are decidedly fewer. And it will espouse terrorism on a scale that we cannot imagine. This conversation led me, alongside with with the fact that I had a second child and we needed some more income, to write a book for which I got in advance. And the book was called Fighting Terrorism, and I said, the West does not recognize the growth of militant Islam, and it doesn't recognize the great explosion of terrorism that is pending. And if it doesn't wake up to this, then the next thing we will see is not a car bomb in the basement of the World Trade Center, but a nuclear bomb. Now, I was wrong. They didn't use a nuclear bomb. They didn't have one. If they had, they would have. They used 2 fully fueled 150-ton airplanes. And that's like a tactical nuclear bomb. And it was always remarked, by the way, the book didn't do very much when it was published in 1995. It did a lot better when it was reissued after September 11th. It was amazing to me, and still is amazing to me, that the governments in countries that are targeted do not understand that there is a great force that is waging war against all of us. And this force erupted in 2 eruptions. The first eruption was in 1979 with the establishment of the Ayatollah regime in Iran, the rise of radical Shiism. And the second occurred a decade later in 1989 with the defeat of the Soviet Union by the Mujahideen in Afghanistan. The first gave rise to radical Shiite terror and everything associated with it. And the second gave rise to Al-Qaeda. And since then, the last quarter of a century has been dominated by the competition and often the collusion between these 2 forces for the supremacy of the movement that is supposed to dislodge the West and many others. Arabs, for example. Moderate Muslims. Israel, of course. Reestablishing the caliphate. Anyone from Europe? You're in the caliphate. This is what we are seeing now. I said this is a much more pernicious force bent on world domination and lacking inhibitions because if I compare it to Soviet communism, also a world ideology bent on world domination, there are important distinctions. The Soviets, it was true, wanted to expand their influence and to dominate, but they always put their survival before their ideology. They always put life before zeal. And any time they had to choose between the 2, they knew what to choose. Whether in the crisis over Berlin or the Cuban Missile Crisis, they always backed off. The same cannot be said of the militant Islamists, because often they put their life above, or rather their ideology before their lives. I don't remember many communist suicide bombers, but militant Islam produces hordes of them, battalions of them, and they smash into ships in the Yemen, they smash into the World Trade Center, they smash into trains and buses in London, they smash into anything inside in here if they can get to it. And the concern that we must have is that this force has a much larger reach because of the distribution of Muslim populations around the world, from Asia through Europe, through Africa, North Africa as well, of course, the Middle East, but also the United States. And even if you can infect a very small minority of a very large number is a huge number. Now we are engaged in this battle with greater vigor, obviously, since September 11th. But these forces have not been disappeared, nor have they been defeated. And the question is, since we're dealing with regimes and movements, what is it that we can do to prevent their victory and to assure that this force recedes and is ultimately gone? Well, obviously, there are things we have to do vis-a-vis terrorism, but there are things we must also do vis-a-vis militant Islam. Vis-a-vis militant Islam, the first thing that we must do is prevent militant Islamic regimes from acquiring the weapons of mass death. This is terror on a scale that we cannot imagine, and we cannot be sure that a militant Islamic regime, whether in Iran or in another country, and there's at least one other, that it would obey the same careful laws or careful calculus of cost and benefit that has guided every other power since Hiroshima that had access or had possession to nuclear weapons. It's not clear what is required to deter such a regime. And therefore, the first thing that we must do is to make sure that it doesn't acquire these weapons. The acquisition of nuclear weapons by Iran will not merely place an immediate strategic threat to Israel's future. It will also place a threat to the neighboring Arab regimes, to Persian Gulf oil. And since Iran is bent on developing ICBMs that will reach the eastern seaboard of the United States within a decade to 12 years and building satellites to boot, this will put everyone in its orbit. And by the way, it's important to understand, for them, we are merely the small Satan. The great Satan is, of course, the United States, and I suppose that makes the Europeans, and I don't want you to be offended, you're a middle-sized Satan. But we're all part of that culture that is held in such abomination. And therefore, preventing the arming of Iran with nuclear weapons is a global imperative. It's a global imperative that must be achieved in time. And stopping Iran from having nuclear weapons also means stopping Iran from giving terror, Islamic fundamentalist terror, from enjoying a nuclear umbrella. Because if Iran enjoys a nuclear umbrella, the kind of terror that we have seen that has been supported directly and indirectly by Iran will grow tenfold, and perhaps more. And don't count on the Shiite-Sunni divisions, because as we've seen with Hamas, Iran is perfectly capable of harnessing Muslims on the other side of the divide, radical Muslims, for this common vision, this common hatred. So we must stop Iran from acquiring nuclear weapons. There are ways that this can be done, I think more effective ways than have been used to date. I myself have been involved in one of these pressures that I think we should accelerate, and that is the economic pressures on this regime, which is dependent for the bulk of its revenues on the oil and gas sector. About a year and a half ago, I heard about a woman called Sarah Steelman, who's the state treasurer of Missouri. And this woman decided to divest the Missouri State Workers' Pension Funds from any companies that operate in Iran. And I called her up. I said, "You're a hero. You're a hero of mankind." She was absolutely flabbergasted. I said, "You did a great thing." And I began to speak with a number of other legislatures and treasurer, the state treasurer of Massachusetts, the legislatures of Georgia and Florida, the governor of Florida, my friend, the governor of California, Arnold Schwarzenegger, and others. And all these states, I think New York is coming in now, have passed divestments that were targeting the companies that were investing in Iran. These are primarily European companies, and the chief one among them was Total, the French oil company. And it's important to understand that Iran needs desperately new investments in the energy sector. This props up the regime. So if you could take it away, if you could pry away these companies, you do palpable damage to the regime and its ability to pursue its plans. And this activity, alongside important activities done by the U.S. Treasury to stop credit flow to Iran, have done some damage to this regime, some damage to its ability to move forward, but not enough. Most recently, this activity has caused Total to announce that it's withdrawing from Iran. But it's not enough. We have to accelerate the diplomatic and economic and other pressures that we place on this regime and make it clear that the international community will not tolerate. The organized international community, whether other powers agree to it or not, this has to be not dependent on consensus. If it's dependent on consensus, we won't get very far. But it is perfectly possible for the leading Western powers to isolate Iran, to create much greater pressure on this regime, and this has to be coupled with the understanding that the military option is there. All other measures will not work if the Iranians think the military option is not there. I say this both from a strategic nuclear perspective, but also from a terror perspective, because the ability of Iran to recruit adherents among the believers, if it is seen around the world that they are enjoying the providential blessings of nuclear weapons, of Allah, as they envision it, as they interpret it, then the growth of terror will be inexorable, and it will come to levels that will make some of what we've seen a walk in the woods, a walk in the park, a walk in the flower shed. This is the first task that we have. The second task is to prevent militant Islam from building terror enclaves in the Middle East. On this too, we had a very big argument as recently as the last elections, because our view was that militant Islamic forces are superseding the Arab-Israeli conflict. They've taken over a good chunk of Lebanon's politics. They've taken over a good chunk of Palestinian politics. And with the weakness of the more moderate elements in both countries, the unilateral evacuation, first by Israel in what was seen as a retreat in Lebanon, would create an Iranian base there. And subsequently, our unilateral withdrawal from Gaza created an Iranian base in the south. And this is regrettably exactly what has happened. We have now 2 Iranian bases, one with Hezbollah in the north and the other in Hamas in the south. From each one of them, we've had about 4,000 rockets pelted on the Galilee and the western Negev, and they're continuously arming themselves with new weapons. So the terror that we face right now is the terror of rocketry, and soon precision-guided weapons that are placed as forward positions by Iran against us. You can terrorize populations not only with long-range rockets, but much more so with short-range rockets, for which you need adjacent territory to use. And of course, the biggest mistake we could make is to create a third such enclave right here in the West Bank in the heart of Jerusalem. It is said that this would advance peace. Well, I challenge that. As you see, I'm politically incorrect throughout, but I like to be correct. I'll tell you what happens in Jerusalem. When I wrote that the militant Islamists would bring down the World Trade Center, I said that because it was clear to me that if they chose one place, if they had to choose one place that symbolized the West's financial power, they would choose Wall Street. And if they had to choose a building or 2 buildings in Wall Street, it was clear to me what they would choose. And similarly, if they wanted to strike at the symbol of the West military power, and you had to choose one building, well, they did. Now, if you had to choose one place that the militant Islamist, the militant Islamic terrorists, and the regimes that support them, if they had to choose one place that symbolizes the nexus of Judeo-Christian culture, they would take the most explosive square kilometer on earth, which is the Temple Mount. And if we walked out, they come in. If they come in, then the heart of Jerusalem would become, well, forgive the expression, it would become the Mecca for all the world's terrorists. It would become, obviously Hamas would move in, but so would Hezbollah, so would Al-Qaeda, so would everyone else. And you've seen how they desecrate shrines, except now they could desecrate the holy shrines to Judaism and to Christianity. If not worse, they could do more than desecration. And they could spark off a religious conflict that encompasses the entire world. We have to do 2 things. The first is we must prevent Iran from acquiring nuclear weapons. The second thing is we must roll back and certainly not create new enclaves for Iranian-backed terror. But there's a third thing we have to do. And the third thing we must do is roll back militant Islam. Now that's a larger task. And it's not summarized in quick policies. It's a contest between global fundamentalist Islamic terrorism and globalization. We live in a period of remarkable change, and what we are seeing is the expansion of human freedom and choice. It's happening now in large parts of Asia and other parts of the world. It's true that economic freedom comes in some places before political freedom, but this is changing the lives of hundreds of millions of people. And I believe that ultimately, in the battle between militant Islam that seeks to put us back to, I was going to say, a millennial, or rather a medieval, a crude medieval creed, an unforgiving doctrine that allows no choice, no pluralism, no freedoms. The struggle between that force and the force of globalization, which with all its problems, and there are many, is a tremendous blessing for mankind. In this battle, I have no doubt that freedom will win the day. Because the burst of international technology, the burst of the information revolution, the inability to control minds, the expansion of the economic revolution of markets to every part of the world, almost every part of the world, this ultimately will win the day. But at what price? What happens in the interim? We were faced with another unforgiving, crude and violent ideology that wanted to achieve world domination 60 years ago. It was stopped by the forces of freedom. Freedom usually wins. But at what cost? We cannot allow that cost again. We didn't come here. We didn't march through the sands of time. We didn't shed an ocean of blood and tears to refound the state of Israel, to have these new champions of a new Holocaust do to us what others did. We won't allow that to happen. But it's important that we not stand alone. We have to forge a common alliance, and our gaze should be on the forces behind the new eruptions of international terrorism. We have to make sure that no militant Islamic regime gets nuclear weapons, or that no country that has nuclear weapons becomes a militant Islamic government. We have to deprive them of bases, and we have to roll back their terror. And we have to foster freedom. I think we can foster this freedom first through economic growth and the benefits that accrue to ordinary Muslims, young Muslims who can see that they have a future because jobs are created, because they have money on the table, they can feed their family, there's a future for their children. This is what we will do with the Palestinians. If we are elected to government, we will move rapidly in economic peace that is not a substitute for political negotiation and a peace settlement, but it's a prelude to it. It facilitates it, much as this happened in Northern Ireland, much as it happened in Cyprus, happening in Cyprus, and in parts of the Balkans. This will help, but it is not a substitute from our point of view for the things that have to be done in Iran. Nothing we will do with our neighbors, Palestinians and others, will matter much if Iran has nuclear weapons. But if Iran is stopped from acquiring nuclear weapons and we roll back this force, then I think peace will be given an enormous boost, not only economic peace, but I believe political peace. Because many of our Arab neighbors, including our antagonists, now understand where the real danger is. And this is very important. It portends an historic change for the better and for peace if we're able to stop this global force. Will we stop it? Well, Winston Churchill gave a speech in 1935 in the House of Commons, and he complained about, I'm paraphrasing, he complained about the sleep of the democracies. He said democracies slumber. What could be done easily at one time is pushed back by confused counsel, by indecision and vacillation. The democracies go back to sleep until they're awoken, he said, by the jarring gong of self-preservation. And then they must take action at the edge of a cliff. I'd like to believe that on this one Churchill was wrong. I'd like to believe that we can learn not merely from the past but from the present, that we can see clearly what we're facing and that we can face it off. Freedom is always won when its champions and sons realized what was at stake. It's time we realize what's at stake, because we must win. Thank you very much.